It was the kind of winter night that asked the city to be quiet. Snow sifted down like the softest confession, rounding the sharpness off rooftops, settling in the grooves of brick and iron, laying a hush over Boston that felt almost sacred. The harbour breathed in slow, ribboning plumes, and the wind that came off the water carried the briny memory of distant summers. Streetlights followed Tremont in a line of pale halos, each one a small sanctuary. Under them, the sidewalks shone with a fragile sheen, as if the streets had been polished for a ceremony no one could name. Nathaniel walked with his collar lifted and his hands in his pockets, not because he was cold, he had never allowed something as ordinary as weather to touch him, but because old habits make a shell. He was famous for that shell. People called it focus or discipline or the simple arithmetic of power, the clean partition a man makes between himself and the world, so the world cannot take anything from him that he does not first agree to sell. In boardrooms and on magazine covers they wrote his name as if it were a docked ship, sleek, heavy, and impossible to move without a tug roaring at both ends. He knew those stories by heart and never corrected them. A myth, tended long enough, keeps you warm. He was late for a meeting he would still win. He had already approved the numbers. He had already made the calls that would make the numbers obey. Somewhere in the tower of glass across the river, a conference room waited with water beading on the carafes and a spread of papers that smelled faintly of toner and the sweet chemical promise of a pen that had not been uncapped. The inevitability of it bored him a little tonight. He wasn't tired. He simply felt like a ladder that had learned there would always be another rung. He thought of coffee. He thought of the tenderness of silence that comes after the last email of the day. He thought of nothing. Then he saw her. At first she looked like a shadow the snow had christened, small, still, tucked into the lee of the harbour light cafe, where the steps made a pocket of half-shelter. Her dark hair had escaped whatever ribbon or dream had tried to hold it. It snapped lightly in the wind, a banner much too brave for so small a standard-bearer. Across her knees she held something that did not belong to the night, a rectangle of cardboard, its edges gone soft with use and weather, its surface scored in careful alternating lines of black and white, keys. A piano a child had drawn into life with patient ink and stubborn hope. He would have passed her. He had passed 1,000 such small eruptions of human need, the folded palms at the corner, the violin with 2 strings in a tunnel that swallowed even the coin's bright clink, the makeshift altar of a blanket and a paper cup. But there was an attention about her posture that refused to be categorized. She was not asking. She was listening. He could see it in the angle of her head, in the way her fingertips hovered over the cardboard as if they were negotiating with air. It was ridiculous, and it was beautiful. Ridiculous always made him impatient. Beautiful always made him wary. "What are you doing?" he heard himself say, his voice sounding expensive and far away, like a room with too much glass. She tilted her face up. Her eyes were not the apologetic eyes he expected. They were steady, warm, dark, set with the kind of composure you usually only see in people who have survived something and grown gentle instead of hard. "Playing," she said. Her voice was soft in a way that made him hold his breath to hear it. "Listen." He did not want to listen, or rather, he had built a life where listening was optional. He worked in declarations, commands, numbers that fell into line under the promise of reward or the threat of exile. Listening, truly listening, makes you porous. The world can get in. And yet there he was, hands still in his pockets, listening. Her fingers moved, not over ivory or ebonies, not over a single sound-making part, only cardboard, a ghost of music. But her body knew where the weight of it would be, where the first note would enter like a clear bell across snow, where the second would lean a fraction towards sorrow before finding courage. The muscles of her wrists mapped crescendos and pauses, and for an instant a strange thing happened. The mind he had trained to distrust imagination stepped aside, and he felt the melody pass through the dark like a thread of light. "It's Chopin," she said, as if she were telling him the name of the moon. "It's what I play when it's cold. It makes the cold listen to me." A smile, small and involuntary, shifted the corners of his mouth. He hadn't meant to make it. He smoothed it away, the way you smooth a napkin you don't intend to stain. "On cardboard?" "The music isn't in the instrument." She tapped her sternum with one tentative finger, then the air. "It's in here and out there." There it was, the kind of sentence that always made him want to turn around and go. He was allergic, he told himself, to any idea that did not submit itself to measurement. He was a curator of proof. Yet he didn't leave. Maybe it was the way she had said it without drama, as if she were telling him the temperature and he could take it or leave it. Maybe it was because the snow was romanticizing everything and he would blame it later. He checked his watch and found he had 15 minutes he had not intended to spare. "What's your name?" he asked. "Liar," she said, "like the end of a song." She studied him then, not the way people studied him for weakness or leverage, but the way a person studies a new street before trusting it with her feet. "You look like you know where you're going, but not why." He almost laughed, not because it was untrue, truth rarely made him laugh, but because he wanted to disarm the sentence before it discovered anything else. "Do you make a habit of reading strangers in the snow?" "Only when they talk first." Her smile appeared, quick as a match, then tucked itself away again. "I thought you might be kind, even if you don't like it." The air shifted, tender and clean. In a year that had been made of unrelenting schedules, a soft thing arrived and sat down between them. He felt foolish, which is very close to feeling young. He moved a half-step closer under the awning, more to share the break from the wind than to offer charity, he told himself. Chopin. Then, "What else do you play?" "Anything that remembers." She looked back down at the keys that weren't keys and moved through a phrase so precise he could feel the contour of it along his skin, like the path a hand would leave down the length of a sleeve. "My mother said the best pieces are the ones that sound like home, even in the wrong hands." "Is your mother?" He didn't mean to ask. The question rose like breath in winter, and there it was, visible and unavoidable, dissolving slowly into the night. Liar's lips pressed together, and he noticed how chapped they were, the small bravery of a child's mouth, putting on composure. She listens differently now. She lifted her eyes again, not asking for pity, only moving forward carefully over the truth. "I still practice every day. It's how I keep the house warm." He had no language for that. And because he had no language for it, something inside him let go of a railing. The part of him that had curated a life made of polished decisions and reverse-engineered risks stepped aside, and the boy he had been years ago peered through, wide-eyed and painfully alive. He did not allow that boy oxygen as a rule. The boy asked for unreasonable things, sunlight, laughter, mercy. Mercy was inefficient. Mercy complicated margins. "Come on," he said, too briskly. If you can play what you say you can play, you shouldn't have to draw your way to it. She watched him with that calmly astonished expression children wear when adults remember how to be generous. Where would we go? There was a piano he could unlock with a single call. Power can be wicked, but it has the occasional decency of being useful. He made the call as they walked. The snow stitched bright little commas into the air around them. Lia's shoes were thin. He noticed and then hated that he noticed. Caring, when you have not practiced it, feels like a foreign instrument, unwieldy and suspiciously heavy. He did not know where to put it down. He moved slower to match her steps without making a show of it. He made a second call, and then a third. The door at the Silverwood Conservatory opened as if the night had arranged itself around her promise. Inside, the foyer smelled like old wood and patience. A line of photographs steadied itself along the wall, faces he knew by reputation, and faces whose eyebrows were too wild to be famous yet. The receptionist, in a white sweater, glanced at the snow melting off their coats and said nothing at all, which felt like a benediction. The hall was empty, as if the day had put its instruments to bed and kissed them on the brow. The Steinway waited at center stage, polished into an absence of fingerprints, black enough to make the lights seem like stars. He had been in this room for fundraisers, for concerts, where applause rose like a storm and fell like rain. He had never stood in it while it listened to one small life. He felt ungainly, like a too-tall tree in a wind that wanted to sing around something softer. "Go on," he said, suddenly unsure of his own voice. She did not rush. She walked to the piano with the courtliness of someone approaching a friend who has loved her without needing proof. She pressed her palm flat against the lid. "Hello," he read on her mouth. "Thank you. Please. There are prayers that wear no church clothes and still reach heaven." When she sat, the bench sighed, remembering every student who had believed and broken and believed again. She lifted her hands and then paused, eyes half closed, listening again to whatever silent metronome lived at the center of her chest. The first note arrived. It did not sound like a note so much as a room remembering sunlight. It startled him because it was simple. He braced for spectacle and received sincerity. The melody unfurled, finding its spine, standing taller in each measure. There was strength in it, yes, the kind that comes from discipline taught by hunger and hunger taught by love, but there was also a gentleness he could feel in the places between notes, the small, luminous rests where the music trusted him to stay. He had not realized until that second how long it had been since anything had trusted him. We set out to be precise and end up becoming brittle. He thought he had chosen the former and been spared the latter. He discovered, listening to her, that he had been wrong. The phrases rose, braided of sorrow and courage in equal strands, healing and soothing and kind, and in each braid he recognized a memory of something he had outlawed in his life. The quiver in his throat the day he watched his sister sleep behind hospital glass. The easy laugh of a woman he'd almost loved until he'd heard himself calculating the cost. The mornings when he woke before his alarm and the city had not yet put its armor on. They arrived in a small procession, bowed their heads, and passed through him quietly. He did not stop them. He let the procession continue. A gentle peace took his hands like a friend and asked nothing. There are moments that do not fix a life, but soften it into a shape that can be mended. This was one. He stood very still. In a row near the back, a professor who had forgotten her scarf in the office leaned in the doorway, moving as if she were trying not to relocate a miracle. The custodial staff paused outside the door with their cart, and then reversed silently, as though backing away from a sleeping child. The world is loud until the right grace happens. Then it remembers how to be quiet. When the last chord faded, the silence left behind was not empty. It was the kind of silence that allows a person to hear the better part of himself. Laya's hands hovered over the keys for one more breath, then settled in her lap. She looked at him the way people look at the ocean after the tide changes, wonder mixed with the practical question of how to cross. He could have congratulated her. He could have offered lessons, a scholarship, a carefully measured stipend wrapped in policy like a sterile instrument. He could have done what a man like him does, transform wonder into a line item and efficiency into a kind of compassion. He did none of that. A softness moved in him, real, unpurchased, without a single decimal point to its name, and he let it live. "You play like a person who knows how to keep a promise," he said. It was too intimate and too true, and he could not take it back. Laya's smile returned, brighter this time, shy only at the edges. "I do," she said. "I promised her I wouldn't stop. I promised her I would find warmth, the kind that lasts." He could feel his cynicism rummaging around for a place to stand. It found none. There are statements that, when spoken by the right mouth, make every defense look ridiculous. He realized his coat was still on and shrugged out of it, suddenly aware of how small her shoulders were. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "There's soup in the cafe downstairs that is almost famous." "Almost famous is safer," she said, rising. "Fame makes people forget how to listen." "Does it?" he asked gently as they walked off the stage together. "It made my mother tired," she answered, not looking at him for a moment. "Not the stage, the way people stopped seeing her when she stopped playing. I think real love keeps seeing you, even when the music is quiet." There was a handrail. He did not think. He offered his hand instead, and she accepted it with the gravity of a person who understands that kindness is a bridge, not a favor. They went down the aisle hand in hand, and it did not feel like an executive escorting a child. It felt like walking beside a different version of himself, one that had refused to become cold. The cafe smelled like cinnamon and surrender. The young man behind the counter had a textbook open, and the faraway look of someone memorizing something his heart was not invited to understand. He brightened at the sight of Laya's snow-dusted hair. "You two look like the cover of a book I'd actually read," he said, sliding 2 mugs toward them. "On the house, if you promise to tell me it's a love story." "It is," Laya said promptly, and Nathaniel felt the floor of his chest shift. She considered the question a second longer, then added, "But not the kind that hurries." The young man saluted the wisdom and went back to his cruel textbook. They took a table by the window where the snow performed its slow and necessary dance. The soup arrived, steam braided with the sweet breath of bread. Laya cupped the bowl in both hands, and the way she exhaled into it undid him, because relief is a form of music, and he had forgotten how lovely it sounds when it's quiet. "I'm Nathaniel," he said, finally remembering how introductions work when there isn't an agenda attached to them. "I know," she said without vanity. "You look like your buildings." This time his laugh was honest and surprised and just a little boyish. "What does that even mean?" "Tall, glass, a lot of lights on at night." She dunked a corner of bread. "Strong enough to keep the wind out, but also lonely when people have gone home." He couldn't argue. He didn't try. Outside, a couple hurried past, the woman's scarf trailing like a comet, the man's hand on the small of her back in an easy promise he seemed delighted to keep. Warmth lit in the window's fog, a small halo where her breath had touched the glass. He thought of the office across the river and the people waiting and the polite choreography of that room. He thought of his sister. He thought of a piano that had been patient for a very long time. He thought of the surprising sweetness of soup you don't have to eat alone. "I can help," he said softly, and it felt like a vow he had been carrying so long he'd forgotten his shoulders were sore. "If you want help, if you don't, I can listen." "Listen," she repeated, savoring the shape of the word. "That's the healing part." She looked at him, small and sure. "Help can come later." The night moved around them. The city gathered itself up and shook itself off and continued with all its urgent errands, and none of that mattered because the important thing had already arrived. He did not fall in love, not the way songs teach you to. He fell toward tenderness, a slow, relieving tilt, like a field bowing in the direction of rain. In a world where he had taught himself to map every corridor and lock every door, he found an open window and leaned into the air. It smelled like cinnamon and snow and the complicated, soothing chemistry of something beginning. They finished their bowls. He tore the bread and gave her the center, the softest part. She smiled down at it as if he had given her a necklace. When they stepped back into the night, the snow had grown shy, yielding to a silvery drift that turned streetlight into blessing. He lifted his face to it and felt absurdly forgiven. Laya tucked the cardboard under her arm with care that looked like love. He offered his scarf without making a speech about it, and she looped it twice, solemn with gratitude. They walked a few blocks in companionable silence, their footsteps practicing the rhythm of something steady. He would return to the tower, of course he would, and the tower would hum, obedient as always. But when he arrived, his reflection in the black glass would not be the same. The corners had softened. The lines had lost a little of their brittle correctness. He would find that he was listening more than he was hearing. He would find that laughter, when it returned, tasted like a second cup of coffee on a morning when you did not expect to be loved and were. Just before they parted, Leia stopped under a light that had stolen all the gold from the snow. "You don't have to fix everything," she said, as if reading the hurried map he was already sketching in his head. "You can just come back." "Here?" he asked, surprised by the ache in the single syllable. "To the listening," she said simply. "It's warm there." He nodded, because he could not yet name what she had given him and did not want to cheapen it with strategy. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his coat in a gesture that felt half gallant and half embarrassed, and watched her go, this small ambassador of a gentler country, making her way through a city that had learned to humble itself for a night. He stayed until her figure turned the corner and vanished into the softly falling grace. Only then did he look up and realize the sky had one star brave enough to keep watch over a harbor that had forgotten how to be cruel. When he finally walked on, the snow accepted his weight without judgment. Each step made a sound like paper turning. He imagined the next page. He imagined her hands on real keys, not because cardboard was unworthy, but because love, when it is true, likes to give the world instruments worthy of the music already living inside. He imagined soup that would not be eaten quickly. He imagined a life with fewer calculations and more pauses in which to let the simple, healing things arrive. He imagined that softness, like a promise, waiting in the doorway of tomorrow. And for the first time in a very long time, he let the night set its gentle hand between his shoulder blades and guide him home. The night after their first encounter refused to loosen its hold on Nathaniel's mind. He had returned to his penthouse with its glass walls and its skyline views, but the silence there felt different. It was no longer the silence of control and victory. It was the silence of absence, the echo of something tender that had slipped into his heart and refused to leave. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching city light, but for the first time in years he did not finish it. His mind wandered back to the sound of phantom music, to the sight of small fingers moving across cardboard keys with a courage greater than wealth. He had built an empire on certainty. Numbers obeyed him, contracts bent to his will, and markets shifted because he desired it. But the girl, Lyra, was not a number, not a contract, not a market. She was a melody. Melodies could not be owned. They could only be listened to, felt, received, and that unsettled him in ways his enemies never could. The following day, his schedule roared with meetings. Assistants scurried, phones rang, screens bled with graphs and charts, but underneath it all, he felt a pulse of something softer, almost healing, threading through his ribs. At odd moments, he would catch himself remembering the way she said, "The music isn't in the instrument, it's in here," pressing her small hand to her chest. That sentence kept returning, not like an argument, but like a prayer. By evening, he could no longer endure the noise of his empire. He dismissed his driver, walked through the winter air, and found himself outside the modest building where the conservatory's light glowed faintly. He had no business there, and yet he entered. Inside, he found her again, not in the grand hall this time, but in a smaller practice room. She sat at a worn, upright piano, sleeves rolled above her wrists, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. She did not notice him at first. Her music filled the dim room with something delicate and alive, each note breathing warmth into the chilled air. It was not perfect. Her fingers sometimes stumbled, the old keys responded with uneven tone, but it was honest. He stood there, a man with every reason to be anywhere else, and listened. For once, he did not calculate, did not critique. He simply allowed the sound to soften him. It felt like water against stone, like light pressing gently against shutters long closed. Healing in its quiet insistence. When she finally looked up and saw him, she smiled in a way that suggested she had known he would come. "You're late," she teased softly, as though she had been waiting all along. He almost laughed. "Am I expected now?" "Music expects everyone who needs it," she replied. "You look like someone who needed to listen." He took a slow breath and for the first time admitted, "Maybe I do." They spoke after she played, their conversation meandering like the slow unwinding of a ribbon. She told him about her mother, about promises whispered in dim apartments, about practicing with nothing but cardboard and faith. He told her very little about himself. His words were still guarded, his secrets armored. but she did not press. Instead, she offered silence where he might have expected curiosity, and in that silence he felt strangely safe. Hours slipped away. The city outside glittered with cold ambition, but within those walls time was warm and forgiving. He noticed how her laughter rose like small bells, how her seriousness made her seem older than her years, and how every sentence she spoke seemed to stitch something invisible inside him back together. As he walked her home that night, snow whispering under their steps, he realized he had cancelled every meeting without regret. The world would wait. What mattered was here, a girl with music in her veins and healing in her words, teaching a man who had forgotten how to feel that perhaps it was not too late to begin again. And though he told himself this was only curiosity, deep down he knew it was already much more. Nathaniel had always considered his mornings a fortress, walled with routine, guarded by efficiency, designed so that nothing unpredictable could intrude. The sharp hiss of the espresso machine, the sound of polished shoes across marble floors, the city skyline cut into obedient lines by the floor-to-ceiling glass. These were the elements of a man who lived as though the day itself worked for him. Yet, on this morning, he noticed the silence first. He noticed how his apartment, usually humming with emails and scheduled calls, seemed too wide, too hollow. The silence did not feel like victory, it felt like loneliness disguised as order. And into that silence drifted the memory of music. Not music played on a Steinway or a concert stage, but music coaxed out of cardboard and hope. He closed his eyes, and the image came unbidden, small fingers moving with conviction, a child's voice insisting that truth lived not in the instrument but in the heart. He tried to dismiss it as sentiment. He told himself he had too much work to do, too many numbers to arrange, too many empires to expand. But some truths, once heard, refuse to be forgotten. They linger, soft but insistent, like healing rain tapping against glass until even stone begins to listen. By noon he found himself restless in a way he had never been. His assistants noticed. They mistook it for irritation and rushed to fill the gaps with reports and updates, but their voices seemed distant, like static from a broken radio. He waved them away. The city stretched beneath him, glittering with its constant hunger, and for once it seemed to him less like opportunity and more like noise. He left the tower without explanation. He did not know where his feet would take him until they carried him back to the conservatory. Perhaps it was fate, or perhaps it was the human heart simply obeying its own quiet compass. Inside, he found her again. Lyra. She was seated before the upright piano in the practice room, her small frame surrounded by shadows of instruments that had outlived countless students. The room smelled faintly of varnish and old wood, a scent that felt strangely comforting. She looked up as he entered, as if she had been expecting him. "You came back," she said simply, her smile soft as dawn. He hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. "I had work." He paused, almost embarrassed by the truth. "But it seems the work could wait." "Music doesn't mind waiting," she answered, turning back to the keys. "It only minds when people forget." The words touched something inside him he had not realized was still tender. He sat in a chair by the wall, content to listen. She began to play, not with the polish of a performer seeking applause, but with the sincerity of a soul speaking its native language. The melody was gentle, carrying threads of sorrow, but weaving them into hope. Each note felt like a breath, and each breath carried the weight of memory and the promise of healing. Nathaniel leaned back, closing his eyes. The music filled the room like light filtering through leaves. For years he had armored himself with control, with indifference, with the cold steel of success. But here, in this small practice room, a child's music found the cracks in his armor and slipped through. It did not break him. It softened him. And sometimes, he thought, softening is the truest kind of strength. When the last note faded, she looked at him expectantly. "Well?" He swallowed against the knot in his throat. "It's remarkable." She tilted her head. "Not remarkable, just honest. Music only works if you're honest." He laughed quietly, though it wasn't a laugh of amusement. "I wouldn't know. I've built my life on anything but honesty." "Maybe that's why you need music," she said, as if it were the simplest equation in the world. They talked then, not about contracts or markets or the future of empires, but about smaller things, the taste of soup on a cold night, the way snow sometimes glitters like stars if you tilt your head just right, the memory of her mother humming while washing dishes. He shared pieces of himself he hadn't revealed in years, not grand confessions, but fragments of childhood, memories of running through fields with his sister, the sting of loss when she was gone. Laya listened with a patience beyond her years. She did not judge, did not offer easy comfort. She simply listened. And that, he realized, was healing in itself. As the afternoon waned, Nathaniel felt a strange reluctance to leave. The world outside was waiting, impatient and insistent, but he found himself unwilling to step back into it. Here, time seemed different, slower, kinder. He watched her hands on the keys, noticed the determination in her brow, the resilience in her smile. She was a child who had known loss, yet she carried herself with grace that many adults never mastered. "You shouldn't be alone here at night," he said finally, his protective instinct surprising even himself. She shrugged. "I'm never really alone. Music keeps me company, and sometimes—" Her eyes flicked toward him, bright and unwavering. "Sometimes people come back when they need to." He felt the weight of her words settle over him. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he had come back not out of curiosity, but out of need. A need he had ignored for far too long. The need for connection, for something real, for something that healed rather than consumed. When he finally rose to leave, he paused at the door. "Will you be here tomorrow?" She grinned. "If you are." He almost smiled in return, and as he stepped out into the evening air, he realized something had shifted. The city no longer looked like a machine grinding endlessly forward. It looked, for the first time in years, like a place where miracles could happen, and deep within him, a quiet truth stirred. That perhaps his greatest fortune was not the empire he had built, but the chance to rediscover what it meant to be human, to listen, to feel, to be healed by the unexpected music of a child's courage. The courtroom was nothing like the gleaming towers Nathaniel had spent his life conquering. There were no crystal glasses of water beading in the lamplight, no long polished tables that stretched like runways for power. There was only wood worn by decades of elbows and hands, walls stained with time, and a silence so heavy it pressed into the lungs of everyone who entered. Nathaniel sat in the front row, his hands clenched together more tightly than he realized, and for the first time in years he felt as though he was not the one controlling the room. Beside him, Lia sat with her cardboard piano folded neatly on her lap. She had insisted on bringing it. And when he asked her why, she simply said, "Because it's the beginning. Everything true begins with cardboard." He had no answer for that, so he let her carry it in with the solemnity of a holy relic. Peter Lawson, her guardian of the last few years, sat on her other side, his steady hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Across the room, Victor Hale leaned back with smugness stitched into every line of his body. His suit was sharp, his hair carefully combed, but Nathaniel knew rot when he saw it. A man like Victor was not here because he loved. He was here because of money, because of the insurance policy Amelia had left behind, because greed has a way of dressing itself in the garments of family. Judge Lewis entered, her gaze sweeping the room like a lantern across darkness. "This court is in session to determine the custodial fate of Leah Morgan," she said, her voice carrying both weight and weariness. Nathaniel's attorney rose first. He spoke of stability, of resources, of education. He painted a picture of security, of a home where Lia would want for nothing, but Nathaniel barely heard him. His eyes remained on the child beside him, on the way her small fingers traced the edges of her cardboard piano as if rehearsing courage. Then Peter testified, his words quiet but strong. He told of Amelia's last days, of promises whispered, of a girl who had grown not through pity but through love. He spoke of Lia's gift for music, of her resilience, of her need for stability that was more than financial. It was emotional, spiritual, healing. His voice cracked only once, but even in that crack there was strength. Finally, Victor's lawyer rose. He spoke of bloodlines, of law, of rights. He insisted that Victor, as Amelia's stepfather, had standing. He spun words like a spider spins a web, hoping the court would mistake silk for truth. But Nathaniel knew better. He could feel the poison beneath each phrase. He could no longer remain silent. Rising to his feet, his voice cut through the room. "Victor Hale does not care about this child. He never cared for Amelia. He cares only for what he can take, what he can drain. If this court gives him custody, it will not be a home. It will be a prison." The judge's sharp look reminded him that passion was not always welcomed in law, but before she could rebuke him, a softer voice filled the silence. "Your Honor," Lia said, her small figure rising. Every eye in the room turned. She unfolded her cardboard piano, laying it gently across the bench as though preparing to perform. Her voice did not waver. "This is what I had before, Mr. Cross. Just this piece of cardboard. But I kept playing because my mom told me music was more than notes. It was truth. Mr. Hale never visited me. He never called. He never listened. But Mr. Cross did. He cancelled his meetings. He gave me a real piano. He listened when I played. He may not be perfect, but he is my family. And so is Peter, because family isn't just blood. It's love." The words fell into the room like light breaking through stained glass. A hush spread. Even the judge, seasoned and steady, leaned back, visibly moved. Nathaniel felt something inside his chest loosen, as if years of stone had been cracked open by a child's truth. After a long silence, Judge Lewis spoke. "This court is not blind to the welfare of the child. Custody is awarded to Nathaniel Cross, with Peter Lawson to remain as a co-guardian in daily life." The gavel struck, and in that sound Nathaniel felt a victory unlike any he had ever known. Not the victory of money, not the victory of power, but the victory of love. Healing coursed through him, as if a wound long ignored had finally been acknowledged, touched, soothed. Victor stormed out, muttering threats, but Nathaniel no longer cared. He looked at Leia, whose smile was brighter than any chandelier, and at Peter, whose quiet relief was a benediction. Together they walked out of the courtroom into the winter air, and for the first time in decades, Nathaniel felt whole. That evening, in his Beacon Hill townhouse, they gathered around the grand piano. Leia's fingers danced across the keys, not cardboard now, but ivory and wood, and the music filled the house with a warmth it had never known. Nathaniel stood by the fire, a glass untouched in his hand, his eyes softening with every note. Peter joined him, his voice low. "Amelia always believed you'd find your way back to family." Nathaniel's throat tightened. "I wasted so many years chasing things that never mattered." "But you didn't waste this moment," Peter replied. "And that's what counts." The music swelled, gentle and healing, and Nathaniel crossed the room, laying his hand on Leia's shoulder. She looked up and whispered, "This is home." And in that moment, he believed her. Spring arrived quietly in Boston, as though the earth itself had decided to exhale after months of holding its breath. The Charles River shed its armor of ice and began to move again, carrying the reflection of budding trees and long golden afternoons. Windows opened, letting in air sweet with blossoms, and the city that had endured another winter suddenly softened into something gentler, more forgiving. Nathaniel had lived through countless seasons in this city, but never like this. In years past, spring meant the next quarter's deals, new construction, new empires of glass and steel stretching toward the sky. But now his days unfolded in smaller, slower rhythms, rhythms set not by profit margins, but by music. Leia's laughter had become the metronome of his mornings, the light touch of her hands on piano keys, the hymn of his evenings. And within those melodies, something within him that had long been silent began to hum again. The grand hall at the Silverwood Conservatory shimmered with sunlight on the day of her first recital. Rows of seats filled with strangers and professors, families with bouquets, and curious patrons who had heard whispers of the girl who once played Chopin on cardboard. Nathaniel sat in the front row, his suit crisp, but his heart unarmored, every beat betraying a tenderness he no longer cared to hide. Beside him, Peter leaned forward with quiet pride, and the empty chair between them felt filled by memory. Amelia's memory, radiant as if she were there, watching her daughter's promise unfold. Leia walked on stage, small yet steady, her dress a shade of blue that seemed to carry the sky with her. She bowed politely, then sat before the Steinway Grand. For a long moment, she placed her palms gently on the keys, not pressing, simply greeting. Nathaniel thought of the first time he had seen her do that, whispering, "Hello, I'm Leia. May I play for you?" And then she began. The first notes rose into the hall like sunlight breaking through morning clouds. They were not perfect, not mechanical. They were alive. Each phrase carried not only practice but promise. There was grief in the low registers, the echo of Amelia's absence. There was resilience in the higher notes, the sound of cardboard transformed into ivory. And threading it all was hope, tender and luminous, wrapping around the hearts of every listener like healing silk. Nathaniel felt tears blur his vision, but he did not hide them. For once, his wealth, his reputation, his power, all of it meant nothing compared to the sound of that music. He had built towers, but this child had built a home inside his heart. And in that home he discovered the one fortune he had been missing all along: love. When the final note lingered and fell into silence, the hall erupted with applause. People rose to their feet, clapping until their palms reddened, but Nathaniel's hands were the loudest, his heart the fullest. Leia stood, bowed, and then, catching his eyes in the front row, she smiled, a smile that carried gratitude, belonging, and the quiet certainty of family. That night, back in the townhouse, they gathered again in the living room. The fire glowed softly, but it was the piano that warmed the air. Leia composed something of her own, a melody light and playful, with undercurrents of healing woven through. She called it Home. As her fingers danced, Nathaniel stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, grounding himself in the truth that this music, this child, this family, was all he had ever needed. "Play it again," he whispered when she finished. "Play it every night if you like. This house will always be your home." She looked up at him, her eyes shining, and answered softly, "And you'll always be my family." The words settled into him like roots finding earth, anchoring him not in power, but in presence, not in ambition, but in love. Months later, Nathaniel found himself walking through Boston, no longer as the untouchable magnate, but as a man who had learned to listen. People still recognized him, but now, when they whispered his name, it was not with fear, but with curiosity. He was no longer only the billionaire who built empires. He was the man who had chosen a child over fortune, who had discovered that sometimes the greatest wealth is measured in laughter echoing through a home. Every evening, as Leia practiced, Nathaniel would sit by the window with a book he rarely read, simply letting the sound of her music wash over him. It was not background noise. It was healing, like a balm placed gently on an old wound. He let it sink into the deepest parts of him, parts he had neglected, parts that now learned to breathe again. And so the seasons turned, spring into summer, summer into autumn. The river flowed, blossoms fell, leaves burned gold. Life did what it always does, moved forward. But for Nathaniel, each season was no longer just a shift of weather. It was a reminder of the miracle of cardboard keys, of a chance meeting on a winter night, of the healing power of music and love that had rewritten the story of his life. Because family is not written in bloodlines alone. It is written in the choices we make, the promises we keep, the love we give without asking for return. And sometimes the smallest hands can teach the most guarded hearts how to heal. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the music between the words, I invite you to support this journey. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing how love has healed your life. Your voice, your presence is part of this family too, and together we can keep the music alive.